Hello and welcome back to the Self-Actualization in the Age of Crisis chapter summary series. I'm your host, Ron Rivers, and today we're going to be exploring Chapter 3, Economy, Labor, and Property, subsection Property. So when we think about property, we can't do it without the context of our inheritance of history. That is to say that for the vast majority of human history, we've had immense scarcity, right? So we've always wanted things and needed things. And there is, at the end of the day, there's something to be said, even as someone who embraces a core value of minimalism, there is something to be said about just having something that is yours, right? That you are universally connected to and that no others have a claim, stake, or right to. There's an element of security that goes along with that. Now, if we consider this kind of need and scarcity, it remains accurate in the immediate present, but under one specific different context. We have abundance today, but it is trapped. So our quest of kind of self-actualization in the age of crisis is a means of freeing this abundance to benefit collective humanity. So through the lens of the single truth and relational universe, our primary struggle with property is its specific legal classifications. That is to say that all property falls under the same context. It all abides by a single set of legal classifications, despite the nearly infinite permutations that property can take on. I also want to emphasize from the start, the vision of systemic actualization in property is not at all the intent or intended to abolish all forms of private property, right? That is neither desirable nor achievable. So that's not at all what we're discussing today. What we're discussing is the reframing of legal classifications of property so as to create a wide catalog of property laws that support different regulations, laws, and forms of interaction with specific sets of property based on their functionality within society. So we can't talk about property without first considering the U.S. Constitution and how it defines property, because in our immediate present, the U.S. Constitution and the laws surrounding property have permeated the global kind of commerce ecosystem. So the U.S. Constitution frames property as a core tenet of freedom. Now, it leaves property intentionally ambiguous, so it doesn't talk about what it is. And if we look at legal history in the United States specifically, it typically refers to past courts and legal decisions or judges. So it's kind of left up to the state to really determine what property is and is not. At the same time, what is not ambiguous is that the rules defining property as we experience them today were set up by a group of wealthy, elite, white males, and were intentionally exclusionary, right? So they excluded women, people of color, they excluded non-property owning white males. So I want to emphasize from the start that the legal notion of property is intended to be exclusionary by design. And that exclusionary design really translated into voting rights, right? The ability to direct the flow of your collective community. If you didn't have property access back then, you didn't have the right to have a say in collective governance. And that is really foundational when we consider the problem with property laws in the United States and around the world is, again, they were intended to be exclusionary, and in many ways they are directly responsible for bringing the age of crisis to our doorstep. To that end, I also want to emphasize our current frameworks of property prioritize and support birth lottery as the primary determiner of human access and agency within the world today. And self-actualization in the age of crisis, as we talked about in the introductory chapter, is a means of removing our reliance on birth lottery as a determiner of who gets to express their divinity within the moment. And one final point before we move on, I just want to emphasize, the current laws surrounding property and contract encourages subservience to our own creations. They prioritize and give this kind of naturality to our artifacts, things that we've made, when in reality they can never be us. They can never fully encompass our humanity. We are always more than our creations, but they are never more than us. But our legal arrangements support the philosophy and dogmas that they are somehow divine or natural. And that's just something that we must overcome to systemically actualize and really overcome the crisis. Now, earlier I talked about this solution, which is these kind of separate forms of legal arrangement to support property and contract. And in the book, I kind of outline an innovation I title corporate modules, which is essentially, you can imagine, like plug and play legal innovations. But think about how we might classify property in one sentence. Is pretty straightforward, right? We would give property temporary and time-limited property rights. So what I mean by that is anyone could have access to this specific item, whether it be a physical piece of technology, intellectual property, right? A process, intellectual process. They can have access to those resources once specific conditions are met for a time, limited period, and then after that they'd have to re-review. The idea is we want to build a society where any individual who's focusing on solving a problem does so with the collective knowledge of humanity behind them, right? Empowering them to do so. Ultimately, it always comes down to the same thing, right? We want to prioritize the individual's capacity to express their divinity in the moment. And reframing the legal arrangements around property and contract are central to our spiritual systemic project of releasing the abundance trapped in the world and empowering the individual to, again, express their divinity in the moment in the directions of their choosing.